You've all been very patient, and I hope I'm able to bring my contribution in under 25 minutes. Can you hear me? Yes. I teach in this room 2 days a week, every spring, so I hope I know how to use the sound system after all those years. And what I'm going to say this evening, I'm going to focus on two topics. I will not talk about the Goldstone Report, which I think has been well covered by my fellow panelists. The first thing I want to talk about is a number of realities relating to the situation in Gaza. And I need to do this in order for the second topic that I want to deal with to be understandable. And the second topic I want to deal with, and the main thing I want to talk about, is the impact of Gaza on the wider Arab world. Not just of the war on Gaza, the attack on Gaza. I agree, there was no war in Gaza. There was a war on Gaza, or an attack on Gaza. I want to talk about the impact of that and of the general situation in Gaza on the wider Arab world, especially at this juncture when all the Arab regimes, all the autocratic Arab regimes, all the dictatorial Arab regimes are in fear of their own peoples, and two of them have already been toppled. May more be toppled soon. So, my first topic for this evening is an attempt to respond to the way the issue of Gaza has been framed in this country. The way the issue of Gaza has been framed in this country's media and in our political discourse. I know that students and young people and a lot of people who are savvy know better. But if you listen to television, if you're a masochist and you turn on American mainstream television, or if you are truly intent on suffering, you listen to our politicians talk. You will hear that the discussion of Gaza is entirely framed in terms of terrorism and Hamas. Those are the only two topics which exist. In fact, until the Arab revolutions started, the only thing that counted in the Arab world, as far as our politicians and our media were concerned, was terrorism. Now, I would argue that this purposely distorted, short-sighted, and ahistorical framing is essential if we are to be prevented from thinking about basic realities in and about Gaza. And I'm going to make 6 points about these Gaza realities before going on to my main topic, which is how Gaza affects the Arab world. The first point I want to make is that there are 1.657 million people, 1,657,000 people in Gaza, according to July 2010 estimate of the CIA. Most of these people are not Gazans. Most of these people are descendants of Palestinians who were made refugees in the 1948 war, driven from their homes, their farms, their lands, their villages, their towns, their cities in the southern third of Palestine during the 1948 war. And I think this is an important point. They're not there because God put them there. They're there because they were driven from their homes to which they were never allowed to return. The second point I want to make about Gaza is that 44% of the population of Gaza is under 14 years old. A majority of the population is actually children by most legal definitions of children, but 44% of them are under 14 and under. The population of Gaza, therefore, is primarily made up of women and children. The entire population of Gaza, if you listen to the US media or our politicians, has been demonized successfully by a process of brainwashing that is carried out essentially by the occupying power, by Israel, but also by its many enablers in American politics and in the American media, which have pictured the entire Gaza Strip as a terrorist entity. In fact, that's the term that the Israeli Foreign Ministry uses for the entire Gaza Strip. It is a terrorist entity. It is treated, the entire population of Gaza, the 44% of it that are children, the 50% of it that are women, and so on, as if they, in their entirety, 1.65 million people, are responsible for the acts of its Hamas-dominated government or other groups. That's the second point. The third point I want to make is that although Hamas won an election, a cleanly run election, as Norman mentioned, in 2006, with about 43% of the total vote. Fatah got about 42%. But Hamas ended up with an electoral majority. Even though Hamas won an election, levels of support for Hamas in Gaza range, and it depends on your poll and it depends on when you look at it for, from the low 20s to the mid 40s of those polled in different polls. This is important because this is a population which is being punished, even though 44% of it is people under the age 14 and under. Half of it is women. Almost all of it is non-combatants, and most of them do not even support Hamas. So this so-called terrorist entity is made up of a lot of people who actually have nothing particular to do with Hamas. The fourth point I want to make about Gaza is that the government and Hamas, the Hamas regime, whatever you want to call it, in Gaza, is often described as illegitimate. It's described even by Al Jazeera as the resigned government or the fired government. It is not described as a Palestinian authority. It's described as some kind of peculiar, strange, illegitimate, and unconstitutional entity. In fact, both of the Palestinian authorities, the one in Ramallah and the one in Gaza, are made up of ministers and are supported by members of the Palestinian Legislative Council, all of whose terms have expired, without exception. And none of them have any longer any constitutional basis for considering themselves ministers or for considering themselves members of the Palestinian Legislative Council. I would point out further that the entire Palestinian Authority, in fact, is not legal or legitimate, in that the Palestinian Authority, according to the Oslo and subsequent accords, was meant to be an interim self-governing authority set up in 1993 and supposed to be wound up by 1999 when a peace treaty was supposed to have been signed and a state of Palestine was supposed to have come into existence. Since 1999, there actually is no Palestinian Authority, whatever Saddam Fayyad or AID or whoever it may be may say. Neither of these authorities, in fact, has any legal standing. Both of them are standing, in fact, in thin air. They are authorities without sovereignty, without jurisdiction, and with actually no control over the territories that they purport to rule. The fifth thing that I want to point to, I was going to talk about some of the things that the two distinguished panelists before me have mentioned, and I'll skip that. But the fifth thing I still want to say is that nothing that may have been done by Hamas, and in what I was going to say, I was going to describe how many of the things done by Hamas were correctly described in the Goldstone Report as potential war crimes. None of the things that have been done by Hamas, indiscriminate rocket fire, use of mortars, whatever else, against civilian targets, justifies what has been done to Gaza and the Gaza Strip, not just during this attack on Gaza, which we've heard an ample description of, but also in terms of the siege and blockade of Gaza that has been in place by any account since at least 2007. What does this mean? This means that no goods that the Israeli military considers strategic can be imported into Gaza. This means almost nothing can be exported from Gaza. This means that nobody can enter Gaza. This means nobody can leave Gaza. Very, very, very few people are exempt from these restrictions. What this means is that 1.65 million people have essentially been imprisoned under lockdown conditions for the better part of 5 years. This is collective punishment. Leave aside all violence done to Gaza. The siege and blockade of Gaza, in and of itself, directed at a population made up half of women, 44% of people 14 and under, in and of itself is a form of collective punishment. Whatever the so-called government of Gaza, whatever Hamas or other groups may do, this is a potential war crime. It may be even worse than that. And I would point out that this is something that actually was laid out in the Goldstone Report, and it's not something that Justice Goldstone ever retracted or recanted on in his Washington Post op-ed. The sixth and last thing I want to say about Gaza is that even though Israel withdrew its troops and its settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005, the Gaza Strip is still, in effect, occupied territory, since Israel practically controls the Gaza Strip from without. Besides entering whenever it pleases, besides controlling airspace and sea and entry into the Gaza Strip, it effectively controls the Gaza Strip. Our government, surprised though you may be to hear this, in fact, agrees with this. And if you don't believe me, you can look at the CIA website, which describes Gaza as occupied territory pending a peace treaty. So these are some of the realities. I could have talked about other realities, but these are some of the realities that are simply left out of any discussion of Gaza and are lost in the fog of hysteria about terrorism, about rockets, and so forth. These are legitimate subjects of concern, but the way they are treated as the only subject, the way Gaza is reduced to the suffering of southern Israeli communities and the suffering of Gazans is elided, is in fact, to my way of thinking, a disgrace. And it certainly doesn't do our media, make our media look very good. Let me go on now and talk briefly about how all of this impacts the Arab world in particular. Whatever unreal, bizarro world our Congress chooses to live in, wherever our media choose to reside, up there with Congress much of the time. That's not the case for most of the rest of the world, including a very large segment of the American public, which doesn't pay much attention to the mainstream media. When I lecture in this room, I'm thrilled to notice that very few students ever even have heard of the news items I mention, or of the TV news programs that I occasionally cite. If I mention something on The Daily Show, 3/4 of the class is laughing before I can get to the punchline, because that they watch. Because that gives them real news. That shows them and shows all of us exactly how meretricious, how corrupt, how degraded, how unprofessional much of the so-called news actually is. But for our Congress, for our politicians, for our media, these realities are all elided. But in the rest of the world, what I call the real world, the realities that I've talked about are well known. The situation in Gaza is familiar to people in most of Europe, most of Africa, Asia, Latin America. The fact that Israeli communities have been subject to indiscriminate bombardment is known to them, and so are other realities. So they get both sides of the story. They have the entire picture. There, in the real world, they know much more than what people who are, for whatever reason, restricted in their intake to the mainstream media hear. In the Arab world in particular, thanks to satellite television, and in particular to good old-fashioned competition between capitalist entities trying to grab shares of market, thanks to competition between news outlets, Arab news outlets and foreign news outlets, I would point out, there is extensive knowledge of the exact situation of the 1.65 million people of Gaza and of their sufferings. People often focus on Al Jazeera and say it's because of Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera is not the only TV station people in the Arab world watch. They watch Al Arabiya, they watch a dozen other Arab satellite stations, and they watch the BBC, they watch Russia Today, they watch French television, which has an Arabic station. They watch stuff in English. A lot of people actually understand English in the Arab world. They watch stuff in French. And they have an ample diet of material in Arabic. They watch stuff in Hebrew. Most people above the age of 40 in Palestine know Hebrew very, very well. So they watch Israeli television. They watch all kinds. They watch Jordanian TV, Egyptian TV. They watch all kinds of televisions. Good old-fashioned competition. So they actually have a broad range of media outlets to choose from. And they are very, very well aware of the realities of Gaza, much more than I was able to give you in the 5 minutes that I devoted to 6 of those realities. Now, I've argued in lectures I've begun to give about these Arab revolutions of 2011 that these revolutions have been essentially inward directed, that they focused essentially on the ills of Arab societies and in particular on the awful governments of most of the Arab countries. However, if you listen carefully, if you know Arabic in particular, but if you listen carefully and watch and spend a little time, you will realize that there was something else than just a demand for democratic governance or social equality. There was always a demand for dignity, karama, in these revolutions, especially in the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution, and then that was picked up and spread to the other Arab revolutions. Now, this was a demand for 2 kinds of dignity. It was a demand in the first place for individual dignity, but it was also a demand for collective dignity. The demand for individual dignity is perfectly easy to understand. These were regimes which robbed the Arab individual of her or his dignity systematically, as a matter of course. You need only to have listened to the wooden speeches of Ben Ali or Mubarak or Assad recently, before the first two fell, and the speech to parliament of President Assad, to hear the contempt for their peoples, to hear the denial of their people's dignity, which was implicit in everything they said. Assad actually had the temerity, the effrontery, to laugh as his thugs and goons were killing people in Daraa and other cities of Syria. Mubarak and Ben Ali, you may also have heard. And so the demand for individual dignity is very easy to understand. These were regimes which systematically denied the dignity of the individual, and all of these revolutions were sparked, we are told, by the self-immolation of a man who killed himself not for economic reasons, but because he had been slapped by a policewoman. His personal dignity had been affronted. He also had no job. And the rest, this was the 17th of December. Within weeks, Ben Ali had fled. Within a month and a half, Mubarak had stepped down. But something else is being demanded by these revolutions, and this is collective dignity. The collective dignity of the people, the collective dignity of the Arabs as a whole. This was an important part of this demand for dignity. And it is here where Palestine in general and Gaza in particular fit in. This has been central to what has been going on in these Arab revolutions. It's not been something that people may have noticed. It's not been something that the media, the American media, which has done actually a reasonably good job of covering these revolutions at times, has focused on. But in fact, Palestine, the issue of Palestine, in particular the issue of Gaza, was at the center, at the heart of this demand for collective dignity. This can be seen most clearly in Egypt, which of course borders Gaza, and which is the biggest and the most important Arab country. It's central to everything that happens in the Arab world. It always was, it always will be. When Egypt is in eclipse, the Arab world is in eclipse. When Egypt behaves in a certain way, that has a necessary and important effect on the rest of the Arab world. And this, the way in which this demand for collective dignity and this linking of the issue of collective dignity to the issue of Gaza can be seen most clearly in Egypt, where one of the first quiet foreign policy initiatives of the new regime, back in February, very soon after Mubarak went off to Sharm el-Sheikh, was to ease the transit of Palestinians in and out of Gaza through the Rafah crossing. In fact, the Rafah crossing was part of the siege of Gaza. Egypt keeping the Rafah crossing closed at a time when Israel was keeping all the other crossings from Gaza closed was an essential part of the blockade and siege of the Gaza Strip. In fact, an essential part of the complicity of the Mubarak regime in the Israeli siege of Gaza. It's therefore no coincidence that one of the first foreign policy initiatives of this regime, nobody talked about it at the time. I was in Egypt in March, and I'd already heard about this, was that the Rafah crossing was virtually open for the movement of people back in February. This complicity of the Mubarak regime was something which we may not have heard of or thought of or understood, but it was perceived by the vast majority of Egyptians as humiliating. It was perceived as constituting servile submission to Israel and the United States. And no one should have been surprised in the demonstrations, especially in February, just before and just after Mubarak finally left office, that there were hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian flags in the crowds in Tahrir Square, or that the new Egyptian regime, immediately Mubarak was gone from Cairo, should have eased passage through the Rafah crossing. One of the first major public initiatives of the new regime, just in the last couple of weeks, 10 days ago in fact, was to broker a Palestinian national reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. This again is not a coincidence. The first major things that Egypt has done have to do with Libya and Palestine, the two countries that it borders. Less than 2 months after the disappearance of Omar Suleiman, who, as you may know, was the chief of military intelligence, was the person responsible for handling Palestinian affairs, relations with Israel, for President Mubarak and his regime. Among the things he was supposed to be handling for a period of 4 years was to broker a inter-Palestinian reconciliation. He labored for 4 years on it. Somehow it didn't happen. 2 months after Omar Suleiman disappeared, in fact, less than 2 months after Omar Suleiman disappeared, that reconciliation suddenly happened. It doesn't take a genius to realize that, in fact, Slimane being there was instrumental in preventing such a thing from ever happening. It was Egyptian policy that there not be an inter-Palestinian reconciliation, because it was American and Israeli policy that there not be an inter-Palestinian reconciliation. The disappearance of that regime, the disappearance of Ahmad Slimane, and 2 months later, that reconciliation is apparently taking place. Now, these may be mysteries to the consumers of the American media, but the Egyptian people understand all of this. They understand it well. And this is why the new Egyptian government, which is responsive to the wishes of its people, has done what it's done. So I'm arguing here that Gaza and Palestine generally are, in fact, central issues for the Arab world and for the ongoing Arab revolutions. You may know, or you may be aware of the fact that there's a cottage industry in this country and in Israel which is devoted to proving that the Arabs do not really care about Palestine. It's not really important, ignore it, just don't pay any attention to it. They don't really care. And occasionally the odd prince or the odd president for life will be dragged up as proof of this. WikiLeaks and other sources have been adduced to show that this or that Arab leader in fact cares much more about Iran or cares much more about some other issue than he cares about Palestine. It's true, in fact, that most of the undemocratic rulers in the Arab world don't care very much about Palestine. They've proven that amply over the past 50 or 60 years, in fact. But the days of these autocrats are hopefully numbered. Some of their days, in fact, have ended. Mubarak and Ben Ali, and hopefully others will follow. The Arab peoples do know about Gaza. They do care about Palestine. The new Egyptian regime has already clearly shown this, and I think we can expect more to come, both from Egypt and from other Arab countries. We don't know, we cannot know, how these Arab uprisings are going to end, even in Tunisia and Egypt, where dictators have already been overthrown. But I think that we can be sure that at the end of these uprisings, if there are more democratic governments in Arab countries, if there are governments in power that are more responsive to the wishes of their people than the governments that are currently there and which are not responsive in any way to the wishes of their people, then these governments will no longer act towards Gaza or on the Palestine issue in the servile and submissive manner of the Mubarak regime or of other Arab governments, for that matter. I've said, and I will repeat, that the Arab revolutions are mainly directed at changing the awful conditions that the Arab peoples live under. They're mainly directed at establishing democratic governance, constitutional rule, the rule of law, social equality, and the dignity of the Arab individual and of the Arab collective. If they succeed in doing these things, that'll be wonderful for the Arab world and hopefully for the rest of the world. Hopefully some of this will spread. But if they succeed, they will also remove the Arab cover from what Israel and the United States have been doing in Gaza in terms of this awful siege, in terms of this awful blockade. This is not just an Israeli blockade. It was not just a blockade in which the Mubarak regime was complicit. This is a blockade our government is engaged in. This is a blockade we are responsible for as American citizens. And it is a blockade which we have to understand if there are war crimes involved. We and our government are party to them. This means that if these Arab revolutions are successful, there will no longer be an Arab cover for this. There won't be an Arab partner in this shameful collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza. It means also, if these revolutions are successful, that we may soon be entering an entirely different world than that which existed when Israel attacked Gaza in the winter of 2008-2009. It did so shielded not only by the Bush administration and by the silence of the incoming president-elect, but also by Egypt and by most of the other Arab regimes. As they aligned themselves with Israel at the time of its attack on Lebanon, they aligned themselves with Israel quietly during its attack on Gaza in 2008-2009. What was done to Gaza was inhuman. What is being done to Gaza, even today, in the form of siege and blockade, is inhuman. And we can only hope that nothing like what was done in 2008-2009 will be done again, and that this siege and blockade will be ended soon. The way in which our media and our politicians, the shameful way in which our politicians and our media have reacted to Goldstone's so-called retraction, may in fact have encouraged Israel to repeat such an attack. If you're a careful consumer of the Israeli press, you will see the spectacle of Israeli politicians patting themselves on the back so hard they're probably going to hurt themselves, saying that now, finally, what we've done has been justified, and maybe we can consider doing it again. I hope that's not the case. If it is the case, in fact, those people who have, in effect, said what both Peter and Norman have shown, in fact, is false, bear a share of the responsibility. We can only hope that the fall of Israel's best friends in the region, Hosni Mubarak and Omar Suleiman, will give the Israeli government pause if it should have such foolish ideas. If that's the case, the Arab revolutions may help to protect Gaza from such barbarity in the future, may hopefully relieve Gaza of the siege and the blockade under which it's still suffering. Perhaps these revolutions can then go further and help to end the entire conflict in a way that will bring peace with justice to both Palestinians and to Israelis. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take
towards Dr. Finkelstein, but open to everybody. In light of the recent peaceful revolutions in the Arab world, relatively peaceful, why has principled nonviolence or satyagraha been unsuccessful or unsustainable in the conflict between Gaza and Israel? And Dr. Khalidi, is it possibly the representation in the media that's to blame? So was that clear?
May I ask two short questions?
Sorry?
Two short questions, is that okay?
If you have 1.5 minutes, use them wisely.
Okay. First, just mostly to you, Norman. You said that you think that it was not by chance that the Goldstone op-ed was phrased the way it was, and I was very curious to hear why you think he actually did it. I don't really have a good answer to that. And the second question is to you. I wanted to know, just out of my own ignorance, I guess, you said that you think that the current regime, the current new regime in Egypt, does better represent the will of the Egyptian people. And I was actually surprised to hear that, given that I thought that it's mostly now the military, Mubarak's military, that's in control, and I had no idea why it would be very different. Thank you.
My question is directed to Norman and Rashid. It seems like the main cornerstone of Israeli policy is this keeping their deterrence factor. And I think Shlomo Ben Hamid mentioned in his book that the 1967 war was all about deterrence. It had nothing to do with an Egyptian attack. And now this deterrence factor has an additional factor, which is the crazy card, which would reinforce the deterrence. So I'm curious how effective that is from a military point of view, ignoring the whole morality end of that question.
Well, it seems just Rashid spoke about the Arab uprising. Otherwise, why is there so much silence as the Arab dictators Assad, as Muammar Gaddafi, as they massacre their own citizens, and why is the focus of your demonization only on Israel when there are such massacres going on all over the Arab world? And why is there no such uprising with Israeli Arabs who perhaps have more freedoms in Israel, and that 80% of them want to stay in Israel rather than if there's a Palestinian state going over to a Palestinian state?
I'll try to be brief so that other people will have a chance to answer, and also for you to have a chance to ask questions. The first question was on the possibilities for a nonviolent strategy working in the occupied territories, and why hasn't that option been more fully exploited. In fact, I think that strategy, it's not only the only viable strategy for the Palestinians, but it's historically demonstrated itself to be exceedingly effective. Most people in this room, or at least a large number of people in this room, will have forgotten the First Intifada. But the First Intifada, at least for the first couple of years, 1988 and 89, the first couple of years was over nonviolent. There was some trivial forms of were classified as violence, but they were overwhelmingly nonviolent. and they were overwhelmingly successful. Israel was having a very, very hard time with the First Intifada, both in terms of managing it on the ground and also in terms of public relations. I remember teaching back then, and one student who was neither Jewish nor Arab, just so to speak, a typical representative of the American people, he said at one point, he said, "Stone Uzi, that doesn't seem fair." And that's the image that the First Intifada was projecting. Israel was having a very hard time. At certain points, there were about 500,000 Israeli troops and reservists in the occupied Palestinian territories. If you went there back then, you actually saw Israelis in their 60s and older because they had to draw on their entire population to manage the uprising. Unfortunately, for reasons which time doesn't allow, the strategy was not pursued. But in fact, the main reason the Israeli government negotiated with the PLO the 1993 Oslo Agreement, the main reason was that they realized after the First Intifada that nonviolent resistance, that they could no longer manage successfully the Palestinian population on their own, and they needed some Palestinian subcontractors to do the dirty work for them. And that's a measure of its success. Right now, Israel has fewer troops in the occupied West Bank, fewer troops than it's ever had up until the First Intifada, up until December 7th, 1987. And the reason it has so few troops is because the Palestinian Authority is doing all the dirty work. And so the Palestinian Authority has enabled Israel to maintain that occupation, but it was having a very hard time, as I said, during the First Intifada. On the why Goldstone recanted, we immediately entered speculation, and then speculation immediately allows people to dismiss you as a spinner of tales. And so I'm reluctant in public to speculate on why Mr. Goldstone issued that recantation. But I would say what one can say with certitude, without any fear of entering the terrain of speculation, what one can say with certitude is it's not possible he recanted because of what he called new information. Because on one fact, there is no dispute, no doubt, and no controversy. There is no new information that would warrant a recantation. All of what Mr. Goldstone called in his op-ed new information was A, the same information he cited in Stanford University in February of this year, and he didn't recant then. He cited the same facts about the al-Samuni family, about the Hamas new figure for the number of militants killed, cited the same facts, but he cited them very matter-of-factly, and he didn't recant. And the second basic fact is everything that he calls the new information is simply Israeli claims. Take, for example, Peter refers to this drone image. Israel now claims the captain ordered the attack on the al-Samuni family in the home because Israel, or this Israeli Givati brigade captain, he misread the drone image. They've never produced the drone image. Nobody has seen the drone image which they claim he misled. Israel produced a 350-page report defending itself against the attacks of the Goldstone mission. Every other page was drone images, but this particular drone image they never released. Wouldn't he have radioed his own people on the ground to make sure they're out of harm's way before he sent in helicopter gunships? Nothing about the Israeli claims make any sense. But there's no new information. There's new Israeli alibis and new Israeli pretexts. But from a legal point of view, information, no, none exists so far as I can tell. The last question, the effectiveness of the Israelis' deterrence strategy, well, we have to be honest about those things. Terror does deter. Israel used what it called the Dahya Doctrine. It first used it in Lebanon, as Peter mentioned. Leveled the Dahya, turned it into a parking lot. They killed 1,200 Lebanese, 1,000 of them were civilians, destroyed all the bridges in Lebanon. About $3.8 billion in damage was inflicted on Lebanon. And when Israel attacked Gaza, the Hezbollah was very careful not to provoke Israel, because they knew Israel would go in again and the Hezbollah would lose all the support of the domestic population. So it worked. I mean, we shouldn't doubt the fact that, we shouldn't assume that the Israelis are completely irrational, carrying on like real hooligans, going wild, going crazy, acting lunatic. It does work.
I'll just answer the two questions I think were addressed to me. I'll answer, and I'll also say, just add one thing to Norman's, I think, very good answer on nonviolence, which is that there are constant efforts at nonviolence. In the village of Bedain, every Friday, there's a nonviolent protest, which every Friday is gassed with U.S. tear gas, and people are killed, and people are injured or wounded or sickened by the tear gas. That doesn't get much press. There are similar protests in other villages along this fence that is built inside Palestine to steal Palestinian land, and in other places as a wall. And there are many other efforts that are nonviolent. In Sheikh Jarrah, there are regular protests. These are Palestinians, Israelis, and international activists. There are the ships. There's an American ship, the Audacity of Hope, that's setting sail in June. And there have been other attempts. These are nonviolent attempts to break the siege of Gaza. But let me answer the two questions that I think were directed at me. The first question about the new regime in Egypt. The questioner is actually right. So far, the regime in Egypt has not changed in the sense that the military is still there. The regime has changed in some respects, in as much as the president obviously is gone, in as much as the Amn Dawla, state security, has disappeared. The country was actually run by state security and the police, not by the army. The army is still there, and the army represents an important element in the regime. But there is a new factor in Egypt. The army is not just ruling Egypt. The army is ruling an Egypt that has been changed by a popular uprising. And the army rules in fear of the people. And you have to watch Egyptian politics day by day, week by week, and especially on Fridays, to see what they do on Friday and what the military government does the following Saturday or Sunday or Monday. Almost invariably, the military backs off. One day there's a demand for Mubarak to be arrested, he's arrested. One day there's a demand for the National Democratic Party to be dissolved and its billions of dollars worth of assets to be taken back by the state, and that happens again and again and again. In other words, you have a regime which is forced to respond to public opinion. We haven't yet got a new constitution. We haven't yet had elections. The revolution has certainly not succeeded. It may not succeed. We don't know. But what I was trying to suggest, obviously this is not a lecture about the Arab revolutions, but what I was trying to suggest is that there's the potential for these to be democratic regimes. There's the potential for these to be regimes more responsive to the wishes of their people. And in fact, in the case of Egypt, that is already becoming the case in the sense of being more responsive to the wishes of their people. But the question is actually right. The sovereign power right now is a self-appointed military council in Egypt, under pressure from the people, having promised elections, but none of that has happened. Another questioner asked me why I should be silent. I think he was saying, why are you silent about massacres while I'm beating up on poor little Israel? The questioner perhaps isn't aware, but I've given about a dozen lectures, a couple of them at Columbia, a half dozen of them in New York, and others in other venues about the Arab revolutions. Actually, this is the first lecture I've given on Gaza since I don't know when. It's the first lecture I've given on Palestine. So, in my media, in the appearances I've made on the media, and in the various public lectures I've given in the last 3 months, it's about the ratio of casualties in Gaza, of Israeli to it's about 100 to 1. But that was our topic today, and it's a topic which in fact is relevant in terms of the Arab world. The Arab world is very much affected by what happens in Palestine, and it's a mistake to not pay attention to that fact. As far as the freedoms of Palestinians living inside Israel, I think the questioner mistakens the desire of Palestinian natives of their own country to stay in their own country as citizens of a country which they hope will one day give them full and equal rights, and where they do have some rights right now, in fact, more rights than most people in most Arab countries. There are 2 Arab democracies with enormous limitations. The other 20 Arab countries are autocracies or absolute monarchies or miserable excuses for quote-unquote democracies with gerrymandered parliamentary districts. In the case of Israel, Palestinians vote. Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel vote. But it is not a state of all its citizens. It is the state of the Jewish people. Problems that they face. And that is their issue. And the reason that they want to stay in Israel is because it's their country. They live there. They lived there before most people who are now Israelis lived there. And they're living in their homes. And they feel they have that right.
I just want to give a brief non-answer to the question about why Goldstone did it. I want to do it in the form of another question. How could people be as brutal to Goldstone as so many people have been? He has a daughter in South Africa who was diagnosed with cancer. And people from the Jewish community call him and his wife in the middle of the night and say, I hope your daughter dies. Shimon Peres, who was probably a very close friend before the Goldstone Report came out, issued this unbelievable statement where he says Goldstone is a small man who doesn't know any law. So that's part of the answer about why Goldstone did it, but I don't want to speculate beyond that.
66 years ago, like next week, we saw the demise of Adolf Hitler, and I think it
Demise of what?
Hitler,
Oh.
1945, right? So I think it, as a proud American who's a New Yorker, marking that 10 years ago, in a few months from now, 3,000 of our fellow citizens were massacred. I think it bears some celebration that we just lost that we took out the Hitler of the 21st century, Osama bin Laden. And I think that should be marked and celebrated. Yeah, I do have a question. Yeah, well, it doesn't surprise me that there is no celebration on that. So the question is that you mentioned about the new Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt brokering a truce with PLO, Fatah, and Hamas. But it was also just noted that Hamas said that yesterday that well, actually last night, that they regret and sincerely regret the demise of Osama bin Laden. And if we're supposed to be doing business with these people as America, and also the Israeli government, to have a government that's going to be saying, listen, we celebrate what this person did, and we don't retract, we don't step away from it at all. We want to see your destruction. So should America and Israel do business with this new entity of Hamas and Fatah? And also, what do you think about Samantha Powers as well? So I'd like a little information on that.
Samantha Powers.
Yeah, how will the Gaza Massacre and the recent events, affecting the Palestinian-Israeli issues, impact or affect the upcoming, General Assembly election for a Palestinian government? Now, the recent events, like the, reunification of the Hamas upcoming with the PLO that Professor Rashid mentioned, and opening up to Gaza, which is extremely important, because that puts a lot of pressure on Israel to stop the settlements, hopefully. And, many of these other things here, like the legality of the Muslim Brotherhoods and the impending recognition by Israel of Iran, and, well, I could go on with other numbers, but...
Well, there have been a couple of references tonight to the fact that one of the problems we face in all this is the rather bizarre world in which the U.S. Congress lives in concerning all these issues. And to take the Goldstone Report as one specific, my understanding is that they condemned it and dismissed it before any of them had read it, and they were open about that. And I was at a forum recently where it was being discussed, where Congressman Anthony Weiner, without admitting whether he read it or not, said he attacked it as being disproportionate in assigning blame to Israel, as if you could assign blame equally to something where there was a 100-to-1 kill ratio. So my question is, and to any of you, do you see any way in which the American public can confront these elected representatives? Let's take, for example, those elected in the state of New York and say, look, you were elected to represent a population that includes Arabs, that includes Palestinians, that includes Christians, that includes atheists, that includes many Jews who don't support the policies of the Israeli government. The positions you are taking probably reflect the opinions of a very tiny minority of the people you're elected to serve, and start putting some kind of counter pressure on them as an alternative to AIPAC and all of the people who lobby them the other way. Does anybody have some suggestions or ideas about that?
I'd like to congratulate Peter Weiss and Peter Weiss alone for making a presentation that was, without being overly dramatic or melodramatic, and yet with humor, was fair and reasonable. And I'd like to also say that hissing anybody who asks a question here is a shame on the whole group. Sorry. No, you'll be happy to hear I don't have a question.
This is addressed, excuse me, primarily to Norman, but others may comment too. I'm preparing a talk which touches on the state of academic freedom in America in the 1960s. And I'm getting a kind of feedback in advance which is saying, oh, that's old news, that doesn't happen anymore. And I'm trying to work out a thesis that goes somewhat like this, that dissent about Palestine, Israel, is the communism of today, that is the non-permissible position. So in American academics. So I would like comment on that, and also as part of it, can somebody clear up my own memory as to just what happened to Juan Cole at Yale?
I want to thank the woman in blue for her compliments. I mean that, but I also want you to know that I have very few disagreements with my two colleagues here. I want to address briefly the question of what we can do about our representatives. I mean, what they did in introducing this resolution rejecting the Goldstone Report was almost unbelievable that a group of elected representatives would do that. It was cowardly. It was wrong. What can we do with them? I think we can only try to educate those who know absolutely nothing. And I think the vast majority of our representatives in Congress know absolutely nothing about what is really going on there. And, you know, AIPAC comes in there and they tell them what to do, and they do it. One thing I could suggest is a group called Encounter, a wonderful group that takes conservative and Orthodox American Jews who go to Israel for one reason or another, and takes them to the West Bank for about 2 days, staying with a Palestinian family. And I'm told that almost to a person, they come back saying, I had no idea what it was like in the territories. So maybe we can get half of the Congress to go on one of those trips with Encounter.
I'll just answer the one question about Hitler. I think it was a good thing that Hitler was killed, myself, or killed himself. And I'm not at all unhappy that the person who killed 2,000 people in this city is dead. I would have 3,000, and I would have been happier if he had been brought to justice, but I'm not in the least unhappy. I think you should look carefully, a little more carefully than maybe you have, at what is actually going on in the Arab world. There's not a Muslim Brotherhood regime in Cairo. There's, as the first questioner rightly said, there's technically the sovereign power in Egypt is the same Egyptian military which our government has been supplying with weapons since the peace treaty of 1979. And that is at the moment the government of Egypt. Now what government will result from elections, I don't know, but they probably will, I hope, be free elections. And we'll see what results. But to say that it's a Muslim Brotherhood government indicates inattentiveness on the part of the questioner at the very least. I would say one more thing about Osama bin Laden, which is, and Al-Qaeda and terrorism generally. One of the best things about these Arab revolutions has been the fact that they've constituted a striking repudiation of terrorism generally, and of bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the idea that only violent change can overthrow these despicable regimes. These are regimes that have cowed their people, and one of the greatest things that's happened, starting in Tunisia and then in Egypt, is that the people are clearly no longer afraid of the regimes. And so it's been essentially the power of an unarmed people trying as much as possible to use nonviolence that has brought down two of these tyrants. And this is the most important repudiation, and in fact the most important defeat of the trend that was represented by bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. To do that is through transparency. The way to do that is through representative governments. The way to do that is through the rule of law in these countries where tyranny and torture have helped to produce terrorism rather than cracking down on it. Our government's collaboration, complicity, and collusion with these torturers has in effect helped to produce the very terrorists who have tormented us.
I try hard to discipline myself and to resist any ad hominem attacks on myself, because otherwise I would be squandering precious time on fairly meaningless substance. But I think the person who accused me of being melodramatic has, and I mean it seriously, has confused the messenger with the message, or is trying to blame the messenger for the message. It was not me. It was the Israeli soldier who said it was like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. That was his melodramatic statement, not mine. I was simply repeating it. It was not me. It was Human Rights Watch that said Israel dropped a substance which reaches 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit on 2 hospitals and on a school, a humanitarian warehouse, and on a marketplace. That's not me. That's Human Rights Watch. It was Human Rights Watch that titled its report on the use of white phosphorus, Rain of Fire. They chose the melodramatic title, not me. I can't change the facts. You want to blame the messenger, but I think your problem is with the message. Now, there were a whole number of questions which actually converge on one point, which I think is a useful way to end the evening, and that is, without looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses, and without being Pollyannish about these things, I think there's every reason now to be hopeful that we may actually be approaching, and all the words have to be used with the usual qualifications and caveats, but I actually think we might be approaching an endgame now with the Israel-Palestine conflict. There are things that are dramatically changing. There are the changes in the Arab-Muslim world. There's the new, we can call it assertiveness of both Turkey and Egypt in wanting to see a just resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's the relative, again, the qualification, the relative decline of U.S. power in the region. There seems to be now a repudiation by the so-called Palestinian Authority of the strategy which really began with Yasser Arafat of trying to reach statehood only by the good graces of the United States. And now the Palestinian Authority seems to be reconsidering that position and attempting what you might call an end run around the United States in the hope that the U.S. will not actively prevent a statehood declaration. And for our own purposes here, there's no question that there's been major changes in public opinion in the United States. I was even quite shocked to read when they had the last, I think, BBC World Poll or Pew Poll, where it's a typical question of which countries in the world have had the most positive influence in the world, which countries in the world have had the most negative influence, and it's always the most negative influence every year. It's the same: North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, and Israel. They're always at the bottom of the list. What was very surprising was the result in the United States. 43% of Americans said that Israel had a positive influence in the world, but 41% said it had a negative influence. Now, when you consider the kind of media coverage Israel gets, that nearly half of those interviewed said Israel is having a negative influence on the world, well, that's, I think, a sign of significant changes in public opinion. And that brings me to the last remark about the question of academic freedom. Without going into my own particular case, I would say now on college campuses, I would much prefer to be arguing the Palestinian case than the Israeli case. It's nearly impossible. It's nearly impossible on a college campus nowadays to defend Israeli policy. And not only among the student population generally, among young Jews. No young Jewish person, or virtually no young Jewish person, wants to defend dropping white phosphorus on hospitals. Because most Jews, including young Jews, and perhaps especially young Jews, they're liberal, they're idealistic. If you're Rush Limbaugh, sure, you'll defend it. If you're Sean Hannity, sure, you'll defend it. If you're Sarah Palin, sure, you'll defend it. But Jews just don't do things like that. They really don't.